over here, so I'm going to be kind of going back and forth here to make sure I cover everything. First of all, why me? Why am I here? And what's my interest in traveling to, well, the Middle East? Egypt, Jordan, Israel, Palestine are the main countries that I've been in. So I'll just give you a little history of how I got involved back in 1993. So 20 years ago, this past, a few weeks ago, I took my first trip. And what it started out as is I'd never really had any interest, because when people talk about the Holy Land, I got this image of a kind of a religious Disneyland. And you were going to go a lot of places where they say, well, you know, Jesus did this and Jesus did that. And on the back of my mind, I would be thinking, you know, how do we know? You know, so I was very skeptical about it. But a friend of mine the fall before, and a colleague of mine, said, you know, I'm going to the Holy Land. We're going to take a group from our church. You should come along. You get 3 people, you get to go for free. And that sounded good to me. So it kind of ballooned from there. And actually what happened is my wife went with, and then we have 5 children. The youngest was 8. They all 5 went with us. My parents went with, my sister and her husband, and then some other people from our church. So we had quite a group that first time. That was in 1993, in January, we went over. And I discovered something about the Holy Land, and particularly Jerusalem, and that is that it's a very dangerous place. And it's dangerous because once you've gone there, many of us get hooked, and we just keep going back and back and back. We can't get it out of our system. I went back the very next year with a group from my church because other people heard about what a great experience it was, so there were about 10 of us the next year. And then I went back a 3rd year, and then I took a couple years off, didn't go. I did some mission trips to Africa, but then I also had a friend who was doing mission trips, and he'd done one to the Holy Land, and he was going back to the Holy Land in 1998 and doing a mission trip. And by that time I'd done enough mission trips that I knew that when I travel, I don't like to travel as a tourist. I like to travel and get to meet the people. That's what you do on a mission trip. And so we went over that year, and we worked at a school outside of Bethlehem, as well as doing some of the touring, of course. And we went with an organization called the Society for Biblical Studies, which is what's on my sweatshirt here. And that was the first group that that organization had ever taken over to the Holy Land. And the next year I went back and we did another mission trip, did some mission work there. We painted at a nursery school in East Jerusalem and did some other work there. And then I went back again, and then the Intifada started, and nobody was going over there. It was too much violence. But then in 2002, my wife and I were scheduled to go to Mongolia, and she fell and broke her leg, had a biking accident actually. Couldn't go to Mongolia, and she was feeling bad for me, and she said, well, you should go back to the Holy Land. And they were having a fact-finding trip in the midst of all the violence that was going on. So I went and spent a week over there, more of a political trip than anything else at that time. And then from there I just kept going back with the Society for Biblical Studies, and one day the founder, Peter Miano, said to me, he said, you've been here enough, I should be paying you to come over and lead groups. So he trained me in about 5-6 years ago. And ever since then, I've been working with him. I take vacation time, and lately, I went over in last September was my last trip. I took a group from the state of Virginia, and 2-week trip, and led the group through that. And last April, it was a group from Ohio, and so it's kind of worked into that. Next this April, after Easter, I'll be going over for 2 weeks. I'm not even sure where the group is from. Sometimes I go for a month in January and work with several groups at the same time, and sometimes I just go over and meet a group and stay with one group and we tour. So that's how I got involved. I've been there 20 times, and I figured out once almost in a few more trips I'll have a year in, if you add all the months together and the weeks. So that's who I am and what I've been doing over there. Now the question is, what about Jerusalem? Now some people will say to you, or say to me, if you've been over the Holy Land, well, what was your favorite spot in the Holy Land? What was your favorite place? Where did you? And a lot of people will say the Galilee. They love the Galilee. I have some pictures of the Galilee, but a beautiful spot. And the Sea of Galilee and all of that. And the boat ride on the Sea of Galilee is one of the highlights for many people. I like down by the Dead Sea. It's desert. It's destitute. It's beautiful. I just love it down there. But when people say to me, which is your favorite part, I like to respond by saying, well, if you ask me which of my 5 kids is my favorite, what would I say, you know? I mean, I love it all, but I really do love Jerusalem. There's something about the first time I was there, there's just something about the city of Jerusalem. part of it, I think, is it's history. I love history. And they say in Israel, they'll make the comment, they say in your country, our country, United States, your history is very thin and spread out. But here, our history is very compact and it's very deep. It goes way down. And sometimes it's very confusing because when you're taking groups around, we try to have a specific theme. For instance, it's usually walking in the steps of Jesus. But you've got all this Old Testament history there, which gets involved in it. And then you've got Crusader history, and you've got the modern day history. You've got all these different levels of history there. And sometimes you can look at a building and you can see the different levels of history right in that building. I'll have an example of that in the slides as well. But one of the things about there's the history, and then there's just the diversity. Jerusalem is a very diverse city. I don't think there's a city like it in the whole world. Of course, it is the most important city in the world to the Jewish faith. It is the third most important city in the world to the Muslims. And I suppose, even though we as Christians don't have holy sites as such, like say the Muslims do, but for Christians I would say it's probably the most important city in the world because of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre there. But so there's that dimension to it. And when you walk through the streets of the old city of Jerusalem, which I'll explain in just a moment, you'll see such a variety. You will see, if you're walking from the Damascus Gate into the city, you will see Israeli soldiers with their machine guns slung over their shoulders, and walking next to Orthodox Jews and there's different branches of Orthodox Judaism, but they have different hats and black, and they're dressed with the long hair and all those kinds of things. And the next to them you will see one of the Palestinians with the traditional keffiyeh, the headdress on, and the robe walking down. And then past them you'll see the Greek Orthodox priest walking to get to a service, and he's got all his robes on, or the Armenian Christians with their black hoods. And it's just, and then you'll see the modern day people walking along, and the girls with their mini skirts, and it's just a cacophony of cultures and experiences as you walk the streets of Jerusalem. Well, I should give you a little background. First of all, Israel is a very small country. And I want to place where Jerusalem is in Israel. And I don't know how well you can see this, but you can always look at it later. This is actually a road map. My wife and I took a 2-week vacation there one year and rented a car, so I needed a road map. But this is the nation of Israel from the top here, the green line, down to the very tip of the Negev, which is down at the very bottom there. It's about 120 miles from the top down to probably around Jerusalem or so, right around here.
Should I hold that for you?
That would be very helpful. If you could even actually, yeah. And then, what are the boundaries of Israel? That's a real tough question to answer, because everything over there is political, today's sense. Between all the, and I don't want to get into the issues of today of the Israelis and the Palestinians and this and that, but basically Israel, as recognized by the United Nations, is within this green line that comes down here and around here, and then down to Eilat, down on the Gulf of Eilat down here. This is the Gaza Strip right here, about 6 miles wide or long, and this is what's called oftentimes in political jargon the West Bank, or occupied territory, or Judea and Samaria according to some of the Jews, and the Golan Heights up here. But the whole nation of Israel would fit inside New Jersey. So getting around here is not hard. From one day we'll be in the capital of Jordan, which is Amman. We'll do a couple sites. We'll cross over into the West Bank. We'll be up to Nazareth by supper time. So that's one of the things about there's so much there. But anyway, here is Jerusalem right here. So this is Jerusalem right here. Tel Aviv is over here on the coast. Jerusalem is, according to the Israelis, is the capital of Israel. According to the United States, Tel Aviv is still the capital. So that's where Jerusalem is. It's about, as a crow flies, it can't be more than 6 miles to the Dead Sea from Jerusalem. It's actually about a 20-mile drive because you have to go down it. Jerusalem is about, I think I'll put that down now. Thank you. Jerusalem is about 3,000 feet above sea level. The Dead Sea is over 1,000 feet below sea level, so you have about a 4,000 foot drop in the space of 6 miles. And you can be snowing in Jerusalem and you go down the Dead Sea and you put on your bathing suit and go out in the water. So Jerusalem is very high. I'm going to give you a quick geography. We do this one around the bus, but a good geography kind of thing that shows what the countryside is like over there. And that's the other thing about Israel, a lot of diversity within the country. But if you put your knuckles together like this, and let's see, which way do you want to be looking? Are you looking from the south? So I'm looking to the north, right? So if you're looking to the south, see now I'm confused. Okay, so this would be the Mediterranean Sea over here. And from the Mediterranean Sea up to the Central Highlands, which is where Jerusalem is, right up here on my knuckle, maybe 20 miles at the most, and you go from sea level to 3,000, not quite 3,000 feet above sea level. Steep drive up. Then on the other side of Jerusalem, you go down quickly to the Dead Sea or to the Jordan River Valley, which is a part of the Great Rift, which is where, down below here. And then to go back up to the other side, over to Amman, Jordan, you take a very steep climb and you get up to the top, which is, this would be Jordan, the country of Jordan, and then the deserts off to the east here. And Jerusalem is up at the top here. So Jerusalem is a very high city. So, a couple of things about Jerusalem. It's actually not as high as Bethlehem. Bethlehem is only 5 miles to the south. I always, as a kid, you're reading these stories, and I remember the story about Joseph and Mary taking Jesus up to Jerusalem after his birth. And I thought, how could they take him all that ways? And to find out, I've walked that many times. That's one of my favorite walks, is to leave Bethlehem and walk to Jerusalem in the morning and do my thing and then walk home at night. It's about a 5-mile walk. So it's not that far. Bethlehem is actually higher than Jerusalem, but here's an interesting fact. When you hear the story in the Gospels, it says in Luke that Mary and Joseph went up to Jerusalem, because you always go up to Jerusalem. Even when you're going down to Jerusalem physically, you're going up to Jerusalem, because it's a holy city. So you always think of it in terms of going up. So the city of Jerusalem is quite large today. It has expanded greatly over the last 120 years or so. But the city of Jerusalem that attracts most of our attention is what is called the Old City, or the Walled City. And this is another map of the Walled City. And again, you can take a better look at it over here. But I just want to point out a couple things. The part that are attracted to most of us when we're touring there would be the Mount of Olives, which is outside the Old City. Get my bearings here. That is over here. And the city of David, where David lived, was down here. And Mount Zion over here. Another interesting point. But this is the walled city right here. And I'm going to show you some pictures of that, or hand out on that in just a few moments. But one of the fascinating things about the city is it's divided into 4 sections. The walled city is divided into 4 sections. The red section here is called the Christian quarter. The green section here is called the Muslim quarter. The blue section is the Jewish quarter. And the yellow section here is called the Armenian quarter. And Armenians are Christians, but they have their own quarter. And then this section right here is called the Harim es-Sharif, and that is where the Dome of the Rock sits, the most famous picture that you see of Jerusalem, of the Muslim shrine, and also the site of the temple at the time of Jesus. Now, just because this is the Muslim quarter doesn't mean that there aren't Jews living there. People do live back and forth between these quarters, but that's kind of the way that the city has been divided up over time, and for various reasons. So when we think of the walled city, we're thinking of this part within those walls, and that population, I don't know exactly what the population, 10,000 maybe, sitting inside the city walls itself. The population of Jerusalem, again, is a political question, but it's in the hundreds of thousands of people. Some people say 1 million. It's very hard to determine, because no one is, they argue about where the boundaries are of Jerusalem. That's another political thing, and that's something we won't get into here. So, why was Jerusalem founded up on the mountain here? There's usually 3 things that determine where a city is going to be built. Does anybody know what any of them are?
Water.
Water. Okay, most important thing is water. The other thing would be defensive purposes and also trade routes. But water, and there is a famous spring in near the old city called the Gihon Springs, and that was the source of water that fed the original city of David, the little portion that David had as a city. And so there's water there. And other than that, there isn't really any good reason why there should be a city there. It's one of the fascinating things about Jerusalem. It's not in a place where there's a lot of trade that goes on or anything like that. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the history, but I'll just share it. Oh, somebody could pass these out. Thank you. This you can take home and look at, but it gives you kind of a brief overview of the history of Jerusalem. One of the things that makes it so fascinating here.
Did you get one of those too? No, no.
The first sheet here, which just says Jerusalem through the ages, just kind of gives you a real brief history of the city of Jerusalem. We know that there was human activity in Jerusalem going all the way back. Pardon?
Do you have one more? I didn't get one yet.
Oh, yes I do, okay. Human activity goes all the way back 4000 BC. David did not come into the city of Jerusalem until 1000 BC approximately. So they just celebrated the 3000th anniversary of Jerusalem recently, but Jerusalem goes back almost 6,000 years. The first mention in the Bible that we have of Jerusalem occurs in Genesis 14, when it talks about the high priest, or the priest of the Most High God. His name was Melchizedek. A very interesting person. We don't know anything about this person, but he was the king of Salem. And most believe that Salem refers to Jerusalem. And also interesting to notice that when they talk about him being a king, kings in those days were more like a mayor. They were kings of a city, so they were more like the mayor, not kings of an empire or anything like that. So Melchizedek was the king and the high priest, the God Most High, of Salem, which means peace. That's the first mention in the Bible. David took up residence in Jerusalem. How he did it, scholars debate, but around 1000 BC. The Second Temple period, when the Israelites came back from captivity and rebuilt the Second Temple, was from about 538 BC to 70 AD. And Herod the Great, the Herod of the one of the birth narratives in the Bible, reigned from 37 to 4 BC. And remember, he was alive when Jesus was born, which raises the question, how could Jesus be born before Christ? But he was born anywhere from 4 to 6 BC. We don't know exactly. It's just when they set the dates, they just made a mistake. Very important date in Jerusalem history is 70 AD. That's when the Romans conquered the city. The Romans had been in control, but there was a revolt from 67 to 70 AD, and the Romans came in and destroyed the temple, wiped out the temple. That's the last we've seen of the temple. And then in 135 AD, Emperor Hadrian redid the whole city and called it Aelia Capitolina. And then some of the other periods, the Byzantine period, that would be the Christian period. And then the Muslims came in 638. And then the Crusaders came in for less than 100 years that they controlled Jerusalem. And then we were back to the Muslims again, and then the Turkish or Ottoman period, which was also Muslim, from 1517 to 1917. And by the way, the present city walls that you see around Jerusalem were built in the 16th century. So the walls that are there today were not built at the time of Jesus. Some places those walls will fit in the same spot where they were at the time of Jesus, but in other places they're grossly different than they were. And then there was the British took control after the First World War, what's called the British Mandate, until 1948, when they kind of just brushed their hands and said, we're done with you people, and they got out of there, and then all heck broke loose, and there was a war. And then from 1948 to 1967, The old city was under Jordanian rule, and the rest of the city, the western part of the city, was under Israeli rule. And it's very interesting when you stand there, because you can stand on the walls of the old city and you look down the road and realize that was the dividing point, and right across the road were Israeli soldiers at that time, and right up against each other. But then in 1967, the famous 7-Day War, Israel occupied the old city, and they have controlled the old city ever since that time. Now, getting back to those walls that were built, this other map just kind of shows you that over time, Jerusalem, I liken the walls to a living organism. The walls expand and contract like they're breathing, depending upon what's going on with history. And if you look up at number 1 at the top, around 1000 BC, there's this little sliver down here. That was the city that David conquered in the Old Testament. That little bitty sliver there is not even inside the walls of the city today. It would fit inside, well, Paynesville is bigger than this city. I had a professor in college that said it would fit inside, well, he said Met Stadium, so I'll just say Metropolitan, or the, what do they call it, Mall of America Stadium. Would fit inside there, the city, the original city of David. It was good protection on 3 sides. It actually comes down into a point. There are 2 what are called wadis. And a wadi in that part of the world is a dry riverbed that sometimes floods. And the Kidron Valley runs on the east side, and there was another valley in the middle, for better, lack of a better term, they call it the Valley of the Cheesemakers. And those 2 came together at a point, and so they built the city on the ridges of this. And then on the north, there was, Jerusalem's always been conquered from the north, because there's very little protection from the north. But anyway, that was the city. And then Solomon comes along, number 2, and he expands to the north and builds the temple. And then the city, through the Old Testament times, continues to grow and expand or contract, depending upon the political situation. And then we come down to Numbers 6 and 7. 6, that shaded area there, that is where the walls would have been at the time of Jesus when he was crucified. And then within a few years after his crucifixion, the walls were expanded again. And then number 8, the city was destroyed by the Romans, and they had an encampment there. And then on through into the present time, number 9 or number 12 is the configuration of the walls right now. There's a story about that Suleiman the Magnificent. Suleiman is Arabic for Solomon. So Suleiman the Magnificent in the 16th century commissioned that the walls be rebuilt around Jerusalem. And the story goes that this whole section down here that includes Mount Zion and the city of David in number 10. Well, the story goes that when the contractors got around to the Mount Zion, they had a conflict with the church up there. There's a couple of sites on Mount Zion that are important to various religious groups. One is that in the Roman Catholic tradition, it's where Mary died and where she was taken up into heaven. And also the chapel of the upper room. It's believed, many scholars believe that Jesus' Last Supper was on Mount Zion. But anyway, the builders of the wall got there and they got a dispute of who was going to pay for the wall. And so they got mad and they just cut out Mount Zion altogether. So today Mount Zion is outside the walls. And then the story goes that Suleiman was so mad when he found out what they did, he had the 2 culprits executed for that. Because he wanted the city to be all-inclusive. But to this day, those portions of the city still remain outside of the walls of the city. So when you go to visit the city of David, you have to understand this would have been inside the city at the time of Jesus. So it takes a little imagination when you're there to try to figure those things out. I'll pause for just a moment before I show the slides and ask if there are any questions. That was a real quick overview of. Yes?
What are the walls made of and how high are they?
They're stone. We'll show you some pictures here, and you'll have a good idea of the height of the walls. And I'm not even sure what the thickness is of the walls, but we have found portions of the wall, original wall, that go back to the time of Jesus, especially around the Harim Sharif or the Temple Mount, where the Dome of the Rock is. They've been doing some excavation. One other little interesting tidbit is that when Jordan controlled the Old City from 1948 to 1967, they destroyed much of the Jewish quarter. And when Israel occupied it in 1967, they went in. And most of the old city is very old, obviously. And because of that, and because there's many buildings built on top, there's no way to excavate underground and see what's underneath there. But when they went into the Jewish quarter, they had to rebuild the whole quarter. So before they did any rebuilding, they invited the archaeologists to come in. And there are some fantastic things to be seen in the Jewish quarter that you can only see in the Jewish quarter. They have dug up the ruins of imperial homes of what they think might have been the high priest, but certainly very wealthy Jews at the time of Jesus. They've dug up a site where there was a home that was burnt down, and you can see the remnants of that, and walls going back in the Old Testament. They've been able to dig up all of these things, and especially around the Harim HaSharif for the Temple Mount, they've done a lot of building, and I've got a little booklet here called the Otha Archaeological Garden. This has all been excavated since 1967. And they found steps that lead up to the temple at the time of Jesus. So they've been able to do all this archaeology in the Jewish quarter. If you could do this in the other quarters, you would just find multitudes of fascinating things, but you can't dig in those other areas. So the Jewish quarter is very interesting in that respect, and very modern when you walk through it. It's because the buildings are all basically brand new. Now I can't remember how I got off on that. We were talking about the walls. Oh, and so they did all this archaeology around the Temple Mount, and they were able to dig down, and there's actually a spot in the Otha Archaeological Gardens where you can walk on the road right up next to the walls of the temple where Jesus would have walked. And you can see the little shops on the other side where you would have, when you came to the temple, you could have bought things, you know, tourist things and other things like that that you would have bought there. And so it's fascinating. You can see the walls, you can touch the walls, and I'll explain that about the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall in just a moment. Okay, any other questions?
When are you having your next trip?
Well, I'll tell you that at the end I am taking a group, hopefully from Paynesville, next January.
Next January?
Yep. I got some information on that too, by the way, just by happenstance. Tel Aviv to Ben Gurion Airport. We normally take our groups in through Jordan for various reasons, a little cheaper, but this was a trip several years ago, and we went in on El Al, which is the national airlines of Israel. And we I don't know if you might recognize Phil Bailey, if you know Phil. He was on a trip with me back in '98. So we're just getting off the plane there in Tel Aviv. This is really hard to tell, but in the National Israeli Museum in Jerusalem, they actually have a model of the city of Jerusalem from the time of Jesus. It's an unbelievable model. The story goes that the owner of one of the big hotels in Jerusalem's son was killed, and as a memorial to his son, he had this commission. So it's hard to tell, but it's like a railroad model. You can stand, you know, I don't know how big that would be. Maybe some of those buildings be a foot tall, but you can stand up above it and see the whole city. And come up here, but this portion right here would be the city of David. What the city of David looked like, and then back here is the Temple Mount. So all this now today is outside of the city wall. But at the time of Jesus, this is all included within the city of Jerusalem. So that's the model. This is the city itself. This is the city. This is the old city looking down from the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives have several interesting sites. There's actually 3 spots where Jesus supposedly ascended into heaven. 3 different chapels. Depends on who you want to believe. There's also a beautiful church. I may have a picture of that one. But we're up on the top of the Mount of Olives. This is the view that Jesus would have had on Palm Sunday. And you notice down on the wall there, inside the wall is the Temple Mount. And the Dome of the Rock is right at the right center there. Underneath the Dome of the Rock, I've got some pictures of the rock, but I'll tell you the story about that later. But right in front of the wall is a Muslim cemetery, and then on this side, you can't see it, but on this side going up the mountain is a Jewish cemetery. And almost every time we're there, there's somebody being buried. And they actually ship bodies in from around the world to be buried there in the Jewish cemetery. And off to the very extreme left there, this is the Otha Archaeological Garden. There's steps right here. And some of those steps date back to the 1st century. So we know that Jesus, the purpose of the steps, oftentimes they're called the teaching steps, that people would teach their disciples on those steps. It's fascinating to sit there and realize that Jesus could well have been sitting right there. In fact, I had an experience one time when I was with a group and we were sitting there listening to our lecturer on those very steps, and I looked up behind me, there's little windows in the wall, and there was a Muslim cleric watching us. And it gave me an eerie feeling because I could just imagine Jesus teaching his disciples and looking up, and the Pharisees would be standing up there and looking down on him, spying on him. So it was this is just another view of the Temple Mount. Years ago, you could go up there, and for a ticket, you could actually go into the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is to the left here, that little gray dome. And you could also go into the Dome of the Rock. During and after the Second Intifada in the year 2000, the Muslims closed it off to non-Muslims, and no one could go up there except if you're a Muslim. The last few years, they've allowed us to come up for brief moments in the morning. You can stand in line and go up there and you can get in, but you can't go into the buildings anymore, which is too bad. There's another picture of the Dome of the Rock. This is from the Muslim quarter. Actually, it's a Muslim quarter, but this is the church that's there. That's the start of the Via Dolorosa, the Way of Sorrow. And this is looking back to the Mount of Olives. This is looking back from across the Kidron Valley. The Kidron Valley runs down here. This is the Church of All Nations. It was a church that was built after the First World War with money from countries around the world. And it sits over a rock. And over that rock, there was another church built, a Byzantine church, back in the 4th, 5th century. And this is a place that commemorates where Jesus wept in the Garden of Gethsemane. Right here, there are some ancient olive trees that go back about 1,000 years. And at the time of Jesus, this whole area would have been filled with olive trees. So we don't know exactly where Jesus went in the garden, but most groups we take will start up here and we walk down through the cemetery. Actually, there's a couple churches here. Domus Flavit, where Jesus wept, commemorates a place where Jesus stopped and wept over Jerusalem. Church of Mary Magdalene, which is Russian Orthodox, very seldom is open. And then one of my favorite churches is the Church of All Nations, or the Basilica of the Agony. And then up in the front, there is this huge rock, and the altar is built around it, and it's in the form of a crown of thorns, the altar, or the railing. And they keep it very dark in there, with purple windows, so it always has this feeling of nighttime when you're inside. Really a really neat church. So that's looking back from the old city. Up on the Mount of Olives, there's also a really neat church that I enjoy. It's called the Church of the Pater Noster, and they have the Lord's Prayer in ceramic tiles in about, last I heard, about 180 different languages, and they're continually adding more to this. But this is an important site because back in the day, in the 4th century, an important church was built here over a cave where it's believed Jesus, how do I put this, that he ascended out of the cave? That's the tradition anyway, and also where he taught his disciples the Lord's Prayer. This is another picture of the Church of All Nations on the street level. This is where I got my pocket picked last time. There are problems over there, so we have crime. This is one of the olive trees in the Garden of Gethsemane. Some tour guides tell you they're 2,000 years old, but more likely about 1,000 years. Olive trees grow from the inside out, so the inside is dead and then it keeps growing outward. And you can actually buy branches. Little boys will come up to you and offer you a branch, a little branch off of it, and you think they're giving it to you, and then after you get it, then they want money. And this is looking up towards the old city again. This is one of their 8 gates into the old city. 7 are functional, 1 is not. This is called the Golden Gate. It is not functional. It's also called the Gate of the Women, or the Mercy Gate. And this was built by Suleiman, and it was blocked in. Nobody's exactly certain why they blocked it up. But underneath it, it's believed was the gate from the time of Jesus, that Jesus would have entered on Palm Sunday, if not the gate around the corner, but this gate. So it's possible that it sits over a gate from the time of Jesus. And this is a Muslim cemetery right here. So there are 7 functional gates. If I can remember them, and each gate has at least 3 names. For instance, the gate we come in from the Jezreel Valley is St. Stephen's Gate, or the Lion's Gate, or Mary's Gate. Then there's Herod's Gate, Damascus Gate, New Gate, because it was built in the 1800s, Jaffa Gate, Zion Gate, and the Dung Gate. This is the most famous gate. This is the Damascus Gate, facing the north. And underneath this gate, you can see amidst those umbrellas to the right a little bit, there's a little archway down there. Those down below there, you can actually visit the gate from the first century, or at least from Hadrian, which would be second century. I'm sorry, 7th century. This is a very busy marketplace, and this comes out towards the old city of East Jerusalem. I think this is the Lion's Gate, or St. Stephen's Gate. This is what we normally would come in after we've been to the Jezreel Valley. It's called the Lion's Gate because there are 4 lions up there. Otherwise, St. Stephen's Gate because some people believe this is where Stephen was stoned to death. There are 2 sites in Jerusalem where he was stoned. And there's another tradition that says inside the gates here, and not too far in, is a place where Mary was raised, where her parents lived. And so it's called Mary's Gate as well. We come in there, and this is the church up on the upper right hand corner there. That is St. Anne's Church, or Anna, the mother of Mary, built over caves that traditionally were the place where Mary was raised. The beautiful church has wonderful acoustics. The thing everybody does there is they go in and sing. And you can just hear, it's just amazing. This is a Crusader built mountain. And then the pools of Bethesda are right in front of us, and it's really hard to distinguish them, but there's been a couple of churches built over the pools. But this goes back to the story of Jesus, the man who couldn't be healed because he couldn't get to the water in time. He was stirred. But these are the pools of Bethesda. Another picture of the pools way down below there. And then there were churches built on top of them. So very hard to distinguish them. This is an interesting spot as we continue our way along the pathway into the old city of Jerusalem. We come to the Sisters of Zion, and in the basement they have these stones that go back at least to the 2nd century, that they were used by Emperor Hadrian. But some people believe that he reused the same stones that were there at the time of Jesus. They're called the Stones of Condemnation. There are writings on these stones of a game that the Roman soldiers used to play called the game of kings, where they would take their prisoners and they would dress them up and beat them. And it correlates very closely to the story of what happened to Jesus. And so many people believe that what was going on with Jesus when he was beaten by the Romans and the crown of thorns and all of that actually related to this game that they played, where they would use the prisoner as kind of the token that they move around after he shook the dice. And you can actually see the lines of the game still in the floor going back at least 2nd century, and possibly he may have reused these stones from the 1st century, from the time of Jesus. But this is all in the area where it's believed that Jesus was tried, that came before Pilate, and where he was condemned. And so this is the traditional beginning of what's called the Via Dolorosa, the way of the cross. In the Roman Catholic tradition, you have the 14 stations of the cross. Here you actually have, you can see the 14 stations as you go through the city of Jerusalem. The first station is actually an Islamic school. You can't visit it, but you can only start at the 2nd station. Via Dolorosa is very narrow, and on special holy days and every Friday there are always processions that come through. People carry crosses on their way to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Very busy place, and the thing that kind of bothers a lot of people is as we walk the Via Dolorosa, which for many of us is a very spiritual walk, as you're walking along, the shopkeepers keep coming out and talking to you and trying to get you to come in their stores, and people are yelling at each other, and I keep reminding people that the day Jesus went to the cross, not everybody was quiet. They were all out busy doing things anyway, so it was just probably just as crowded and noisy then as it is now. But the Via Dolorosa then takes you to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is the most holy site in the Christian world. This is a church that's built over the site that is believed to be the place where Jesus was crucified, and then another part of the church where he was buried. Now, if this isn't the exact place, it's very close to the exact place. And it's interesting because I have to say a few things about this church. Right up, if you go in the door here and you go up the steps here, there's a couple of altars, and there is a rock formation there. And we know from other places around there behind it that it was a quarry. And this was outside at the time of Jesus. This site was outside the city walls, right near the walls. And it was likely that they would have used a place like a quarry to crucify prisoners. So there's a lot of evidence that this is the area that they might have crucified Jesus. You can, after you climb up the steps and get up to the altar, there's two altars, a Roman Catholic and a Greek Orthodox. And under the Greek Orthodox, you can actually kneel down and reach down a hole and touch the rock. Which for most of us isn't very meaningful, but one of the things I realized in Jerusalem is everybody has their own way of expressing their faith. And, it's a very emotional place for a lot of people. Very emotional place. And you'll see people doing things like crawling on the floor and kissing the stone of the unction inside the door. They will kiss it. I don't know how many people kiss that thing. I wouldn't want to kiss it anymore, but but they rub their clothing on it, and they bring things that they rub on it to take home. Because the stone of unction is supposedly where Jesus was laid after he was taken down on the cross, although this stone of unction is from the 19th century. And then if you go back through the church a little ways, there's, I'll show you a picture, but it's what's called a euticle, and inside that is the traditional spot where Jesus was laid in the tomb. The tomb is gone. They've taken that all away. But the interesting thing that we take our people to, a lot of people never see in this church, is we go back behind that into another couple of rooms, and we find there are actually tombs. They have discovered tombs here that go back to the 1st century. So there's evidence that this is a place of crucifixion. There's also very good evidence that people were buried here in the 1st century. So whether this is a place or not, we can't say for sure. This church has an interesting history. It goes back to the 4th century when Queen Helena, the mother of Constantine, came and she asked, where was Jesus crucified? They showed her. You always tell the queen, you do what the queen wants. So they found the place. She actually found the cross that Jesus was crucified on down below. Believe that? There is a chapel of the true cross down below. And they say that's where she said, well, where's the cross? So they found her a cross. And then she took parts of it back. They say that if you take all the parts of the cross that are found throughout Europe, it will build a cathedral. So anyway, she did find the cross. But relics are a big thing. That's a whole other story. But anyway, so the original church was built in the 4th century, and it has undergone a number of changes over the years. And this is where you can see different layers of history within that one building. Matt was asking me earlier, well, which denomination? Well, there's 7 denominations that have some type of claim on this church. Let's see how good I can do. Roman Catholic, Greek Orthodox, Syrian Orthodox, Armenians, Coptics, Ethiopians, and I'm missing somebody. Maybe there's only 6. The Ethiopians were kicked out a couple hundred years ago. They went up on the roof over here, and they've lived on the roof ever since. They got their own little houses up there on the roof. But each denomination has their own section of the church, and one of the problems they have is sometimes they get in fights over who has the right to be where, when, and how, because they all have their ceremonies. And so back in the 19th century, the Ottomans, the Turks, came up with something called the status quo, and they wrote down exactly when people could be where and what they could be doing. It's helped. There's still once in a while you'll hear fights taking place in the, I think it was in the Church of Nativity in Bethlehem where last Christmas the news, there was a story about the priests fighting each other over there. But so everybody has to be very careful where they walk and where they can be as far as the priests are. They don't worry about us tourists. So this little ladder here is a sign of the status quo, because that ladder was there when the status quo was signed almost 200 years ago, and it hasn't been touched since, because nobody knows who's wrong. So we won't touch them. So that's always kind of a sign of the status quo that we point out. Inside, this is up those steps, and these are the altars, and I think I have this backwards, yes. The slide is backwards, I shouldn't tell you that, because you never know, but the slide to the left, which should be on the right, there's an altar on the left, that's the Roman Catholic. And that would be the, would be the 11th station of the cross, I believe, where Jesus was nailed to the cross. And then over to the right is the Greek Orthodox altar where the cross is raised and where he died on the cross. So that's what you see up there, and it's usually mobbed. There's usually just packed up there with people. And then this is the Unical. This is the built on the site where Jesus reportedly was buried. And they have evidence that back in the 4th century there were rocks here and there were tombs in there, but they chiseled the whole thing away and flattened it out and built this over the top. So again, there's always a line to get into. They can only let about 3 people at a time in there. And the Greek Orthodox have the right to this, and there's only the priests out there letting people in and where you can get out. And the line could take 2 to 3 hours to get in there if people want to actually get inside. But behind it here, back a ways, we actually find real caves. Burial caves. This is, I just threw this in here, this is the garden tomb, and it's run by the British church, the Anglican church. And this is another, some people think this might be where Jesus was buried, but there's little evidence of it, but it's a peaceful place that a lot of people like to go to because it seems like a place Jesus ought to be buried. Sometimes you find that. There's the places where maybe it did happen, and the places where you think it should have happened. And this is where it should have happened. Going back to the other side of Jerusalem now, we usually end up bringing after we've been to the Church of Holy Sepulchre, we continue around, we come back to the Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall. And this is a young boy who's undergoing bar mitzvah. People come from all over the world to bring their children there for bar mitzvah. And the Western Wall is divided. This is the men's section. The women's section is much smaller. The men have to have something on their head. The women don't. And these stones down below go back to the 1st century. They go back to the retaining walls that Herod built in order to expand the Temple Mount. And when the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, these are the only stones that were still visible and available to the Jews. And so for hundreds and hundreds of years, when Jews would come back to Jerusalem, this was the place they wanted to go, to touch these stones, because they believed that with the destruction of the temple, the glory of God had settled in these rocks. So this is a very sacred place, the most sacred place of all Judaism. The funny thing is, now with the Otha excavations down on the other side, you can actually get a much better view of the rocks if you go back to the 1st century. But you can't get people to change their traditions, so these will still always be the rocks that people come to the Western Wall. As I mentioned, the women are on the down further. When Israel occupied the old city in 1967, there were houses. The road in front of this was very narrow, maybe 15 feet wide. There's some famous pictures of the Israeli soldiers kneeling at the wall, but very cramped in there. They tore all the houses down, built a plaza for people. And at that time, the men and women could be together, but there's some stringent rules that the Orthodox Jews have in Israel. And a few years ago, they required that the women and men could not mix together.
I was thinking the Wailing Wall was sacred to other religions too, but that's
Well, right on the other side of this wall is the Harim Sharif, and so the Muslims are right above here. And they have, I think I have slides about from them, but I'll explain why that's so sacred to them. So yeah, they're right next to each other. To get into the Harim Sharif, there's a stairway right next to the Western Wall here. And so it can be a very contentious place. There's always military presence there in the plaza. And there's also Israeli military presence up above in the Harim, which is right up here. This is the Dome of the Rock. It's built over a rock that has quite a tradition to it. One tradition is that it is a rock where Abraham brought Isaac to be sacrificed. And in many Muslim traditions, it was Ishmael who he brought to be sacrificed. It's believed by some to have a connection to the temple in the time of Jesus. And in the Muslim tradition, another tradition is that in the Old Testament, when David did something God didn't like. He took a census and God didn't like it. And so God gave him 3 choices. He could have 3 years of this, 3 months of that, or 3 days or whatever. And David picked the 3 days of pestilence. And at the end of 3 days, as the pestilence was coming towards Jerusalem from the north, David prayed for God to stop it, and God stopped it. So then David bought this area. It was a threshing floor. And so it's believed that this rock may have been the threshing rock or something. But in Muslim tradition, this is where, in the Quran, it talks about the fact that Prophet Muhammad went on a midnight journey on his horse through the sky and went to a far place. And there he left his horse and went to this rock, and there God took him up to heaven to visit with the prophets. And then came back again, flew back to Medina. But it's believed that, even though the Quran doesn't mention it, the Muslims have come to believe that this is the place where Muhammad went. And the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is not in the picture, is where he left his horse, and then he went up to this rock, and it's from this rock that he went to heaven. And so they built the Dome of the Rock over this spot. This is the rock itself, which we used to be able to go visit. There's all kinds of connections and theories about the rock concerning the Holy of Holies and the temple at the time of Jesus. A good Orthodox Jew will not go up on the Temple Mount because they don't know exactly where the Holy of Holies was, and they're afraid they might walk into it. It might be outside someplace. They might just walk through the area where it was. And they're not supposed to be in the Holy of Holies, where the high priest is. So. Okay, that was Jerusalem. I'm just going to throw some other ones on. This is Bethlehem. This is the Church of the Nativity, built over a cave that, as tradition says, is the place where Jesus was born. It's, again, Greek Orthodox here. There's a little church to the left over there. That's the Roman Catholic Church, St. Catherine's. And the Armenians have a chapel here as well, and I believe the Syrians do. But when we go into church, there's a couple of Greek Orthodox priests. This is the oldest continuously used church in the world. Built by Queen Helena in the 4th century. And in the 7th century, the Persians came and destroyed all the churches except for this church. And the story goes that when they came into this church, they saw some pictures of the Magi, and they looked like they were Persian. So they didn't destroy this church. So that left the church. It was burned down and it was rebuilt by Justinian, and most of what we see now goes back to the 6th or 7th centuries. This is Masada. This is the Dead Sea area. It's not desert as we would think. It's a lot of rock. Masada is a very famous site, where in 73 AD, the Romans built a siege ramp, which you see to the right there, and it went up the top, and there's a story about suicide, the mass suicide of the defenders of Masada, and that was the last holdout against the Roman Empire. The Dead Sea. I'm proud to say, after 20 visits, I have never gone in. I really have no interest in getting all that junk up there. This is Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, or in the area where the Dead Sea, but most of the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in this area. And they also discovered the community of the Essenes there, who they believe wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. So part of the Qumran community. This is the Mount of Temptation, traditional spot where you remember the temptations of Jesus. That's a monastery that's built up on the side of the mountain there. And in Nazareth, the Church of the Annunciation, where there's actually caves under this church that go back to the 1st century that people lived in. And Nazareth at the time of Jesus was very small. Some people say maybe only 120 people. So they take you underneath there and they show you these caves, and they'll say, well, this could be the cave where Mary lives, the cave where Joseph's workshop was, things like that. But what we do know is that these are, this church is built over an area that housed people at the time of Jesus, here in Nazareth. This is taken from up the hill, looking back down on the Church of Annunciation. The church is very modern, but it's built over a Crusader church that was built over a Byzantine church. So the site has been preserved over time. And this is Megiddo, which is a famous Old Testament site in the Jezreel Valley up to near Nazareth. Another picture. The Jezreel Valley is a breadbasket of Israel, a very lush area. And then down by the Sea of Galilee, where we always spend the day, Tabgha, where we commemorate the place where Jesus asked Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" And the Roman Catholic tradition, the primacy of Peter. This is the Mount of Beatitudes, where we remember the Sermon on the Mount. Beautiful Italian chapel that was built up there in the 1930s. Looking down back to the lake, this is the Jesus was baptized, in all likelihood, down near the Dead Sea, but there is a place up by the Sea of Galilee, which is the pilgrim site where people are baptized. And this is where my youngest daughter was baptized. She came to us when she was 20 months old and kind of put off her baptism, but she was 8 years old when she went over with us, and she was baptized in the Jordan River right here. And Capernaum, we know where the city of Capernaum is, or Capernaum, and this is the place. And you can go in and visit the site. This is the background there is a synagogue, and then in the foreground here are different houses. And they actually have a house there that very early on was being used as a house church, maybe even back to the 1st century. And so now they've designated it as St. Peter's house, believing that it was maybe the house of Peter. And I was walking down the mountain from the Mount of Beatitudes, the road to the field on spring day. This is from the top, probably from the Mount of Beatitudes, again looking back down on the Sea of Galilee, which is probably about 13 miles long and about 8 miles across in its widest. And sunset over the Sea of Galilee. Or maybe it's a sunrise, I'm not sure. It's a fisherman out on the Sea of Galilee. And me on a camel. I think that's Phil Bailey in front of you. That was in Jericho. Behind you there, up on the left side on the top, that's the ancient tell of Jericho, which goes back. Jericho claims it's the oldest city in the earth, and they've excavated back there and found ruins that go back centuries and centuries, millennia before Jesus. I just want to say we do work when we go there, some of the groups. Not all the groups. We haven't done a work team for some time, but sometimes we do have work to do, which is always kind of fun, because then you live with the people and get to know them. This is a school we stayed at, and we worked at, just outside of Bethlehem, and it was a boys and girls school run by the German Lutheran Church. And this is their drum and bugle corps, I guess you call it, bagpipes. Boy Scouts are very big over there. Part of the British influence, and also bagpipes are very big over there. So every Christmas, and there's 3 Christmases in Bethlehem. There's the Western Christmas, the Eastern Christmas, and the Armenian Christmas. They always have parades, and parades always include the Boy Scouts with their bagpipes. And just, we also had times have an opportunity to visit with some of the local, that's Rabbi Jeremy Milgram. Israeli Jew. He's also a peace activist. Some of the kids at the school we were at. Just outside the school. Taxi stand. Negotiating taxi fares. Everything's negotiated. That was in Bethlehem. Just a typical street scene. I think this is back in Jerusalem. Typical street scene. They're collecting the garbage. The donkey. And fall on the slide. Okay, we've got a few minutes left. Any questions? Yes.
Did you
feel safe over there, or how safe is it to travel? That's such a hot spot.
It's safer over there, and they can prove this with statistics. There are less murders in Jerusalem than there are in any city in the United States. We have never, in 20 visits over there, I have never run into any problems. Well, I have my pocket picked once. That's a major crime that you'll find.
But you don't feel nervous or?
No. If by chance something's going on someplace, you always know about it. The bus drivers know exactly what's going on wherever, and they're not going to get themselves in any trouble, so they'll say, you know, we should stay out of Hebron today. And we don't go to Hebron very often, but you know where you should be, or where you can be. But when we take groups over there, we oftentimes stay in Bethlehem, and we tell them at night, go out and walk the streets and do what you want to do. Go have a good time, and nobody's ever had any problems. The Palestinians are very, very kind and generous people, and they don't want to see you get hurt either. So never had anything that's ever approached crisis or anything like that. I mean, I was there during the Intifada, and that was a special trip of fact finding, and that you had to be pretty hardcore to go there. And I just saw some tear gas being thrown around, but you know, that's in the past now.
So do you fly like to Europe and then to the Holy Land?
Sometimes you can fly directly from Chicago, New York, right to Tel Aviv or to Amman.
How many hours?
Oh, probably 12 hours. 12 hours.
Total from?
Yeah,
Cities
from
to-
Chicago. Say from Chicago to Tel Aviv, 12 hours.
What language do you speak there, or do they speak,
Arabic, Hebrew, and English.
so
So-
most people understand all three?
Well, the road signs, most of the road signs are all three. You'll see the Hebrew on the top, Arabic, and then English. And it depends on where you're at. In Bethlehem, where we stay around that area, we're in the tourist area, they almost all speak English. The people that we work with, the bus drivers and that, they speak Hebrew, they speak Arabic. I had a taxi driver once up in Nazareth, he spoke 7 languages, and he was learning Russian. And the way he learned languages by talking to the people in his cab.
What foods do you eat?
Well, a lot of fruits and vegetables. A typical breakfast, they have what they call the Israeli breakfast. It's a spread, it's a buffet, and they might have some eggs, but you're not surprised they have cucumbers and tomatoes for breakfast, and yogurt, and
All locally grown
Yep.
things?
yep, and lots of different lamb for supper, chicken.
And currency would be,
It's called the Israeli shekel,
and they
or the
all
new
use
Israeli
the
shekel.
same currency?
In that, in Israel and the West Bank, they all use the new Israeli shekel. If you go to Jordan, and it's a dinar, so you got to use something different over there. But yeah, as far as the food, the most famous thing would be falafel. Falafels, they're made out of chickpeas, and they're fried in oil. And very good. And then they stuff them in a pita bread. They open up the pita bread and put salad in there, and put your. You always have to be careful when you're traveling. I was at one place once, and we like to stop at places that are offbeat, out of the way places that the locals use for eating, not the tourists. And we were at one place, and ordered a falafel. He said, "Do you want fries with that?" And I said, "Yeah, I can take fries with that." And I got my falafel, and I was, well, where are the fries? Well, they put them right inside. They put them on the bottom there, so then you pile everything else in. So everything goes into your falafel sandwich. And then if you want meat, you get shawarma, and they have these big rotisseries that spin around, and they just shave the meat off, and they put the meat in. That could be lamb, or it could be chicken.
What about water? Do you drink the water?
Yeah, any place in Israel you can drink the water. Most people drink bottled water anyway, but you can drink the water out of the taps.
What do people do for a living, like in Jerusalem?
Well, the main industries, besides tourism,
Which is huge, I suppose.
high tech.
All right.
The high tech diamonds are big. I've heard sometimes that in some places maybe #1 industry is diamonds. They import them, and then they do whatever you do to diamonds. They're kind of taking over from, is it Belgium? Who does the diamonds up there? Holland or Belgium, someplace?
There's
Antwerp.
years.
Anyway, they've taken away from there, kind of. So, and agriculture.
Is there much arable land? I mean,
Oh yeah,
okay.
yeah. Well, I mean, I said the state of New Jersey, The Jezreel Valley is quite lush. You can get sometimes 3, maybe 4 crops a year out of the ground. All along the Jordan River Valley, they've done some irrigation. There's farming there, and along the sea coast, there's a belt of area there. Down south, it's desert, so there's nothing down there but grazing. The Bible talks about a land of milk and honey, and we misunderstand what that means. What milk and honey means is milk means pasture land. So when Moses was told this will be a land of milk and honey, it'll be a good place for your sheep and your goats. And honey is not bee honey. It's from date palms, and you can buy that over there. You can buy jars of the date palm honey, and so that refers to the vegetation. That refers to the fact that this will be a land that grows lots of crops and is good. So it's good for both, the best of both worlds. You can grow things and you can.
Do individual families have gardens?
Oh yes, if they're out in the countryside.
It looks like such a country that, what do you eat? I mean, it
Yes.
looks
In cities,
barren.
they're running the same problems we are. I mean, overpopulation and water's a huge problem. I always said, if there's a third world war or something, it's not going to be oil, it's going to be water.
Yeah.
Because very precious over there. And one of the problems that they face, the Jordan River, when we go across the Jordan River to go into the West Bank from Jordan, people look at it, it's probably maybe as wide as this room. I don't think it's even that wide. But it dries up by the time it gets to the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is dying. The Dead Sea is shrinking every year. It's a national, it's a worldwide crisis that we'll never lose it entirely, but it's just because they're mining minerals out of it. There's no outlet of the Dead Sea. Evaporation is taking the water, and there's very little water going into it now because they're taking the water out. Up north of the Sea of Galilee, they're taking the water out for irrigation purposes. And the same thing in Jordan, where the rivers come into the Jordan River, they're taking the water out before it gets there, so the water's not even getting to the Sea of Galilee. And they've had drought for many years, and so the Sea of Galilee is shrunk quite a bit. So the water's a huge issue over there. And, not just Israel, but that whole region.
when you go in January, what's the season? What are the seasons?
Winter. Yeah, there's 2 reasons to go in. There's a good reason not to go in January, and there's a good reason to go in January. The reason not to go is it's a rainy season. Although, first time I went there, we had such gorgeous weather in January, and I've had many Januaries where it's been gorgeous. But the second reason why you go is because it's cheap. People want to go when it's warmer out. So, but you can always go to the Dead Sea and it's warm.
So what is their temperature variation?
Well, in January you can get snow up in Jerusalem. We've been there. Well, at one trip when Phil went with me, that was in March, and we were supposed to. Our job at the school was to go out and prune the vineyards. We were going to work in the vineyards, and the day we got up to do that, there was about that much snow on the ground. Which isn't a lot, but it shuts everything down over there. And if you can see the hills that they have to drive on, I mean, nobody drives, nobody does anything. School was closed. So you can get snow in the wintertime. Not frequently. But up in Jerusalem and that, in the winter, it can be in the 40s, 50s. But in the summertime, it could be close to 100. And down by the Dead Sea, in the wintertime, it's probably usually around the 60s. And then in the summertime, 120.
But each of these gates are now, it showed just people walking in,
Right.
so they don't actually
There's a couple
go
gates.
inside.
There's a couple
the
gates you can
vehicles.
drive in. There's just a couple. You can drive in the Jaffa Gate. The Jaffa Gate, which faces to the west towards the city of Jaffa, was one of those small gates. But in 1898, when they opened the Church of the Redeemer, which is Lutheran Church, Kaiser Wilhelm came, and they couldn't get his carriage through, so they tore the whole wall down. So now that's a wide wall, and cars go in there all the time. And then the Dung Gate you can drive in, and the New Gate you can drive in, but you can't go very far. So you get in there, and you have to be careful, because there are cars driving. Stevens Gate, people drive in. So when you're walking down the Via Dolorosa, all of a sudden, somebody in the back says, car, and everybody gets up against the wall as far as they can.
So when you're on these tours, are you mostly walking?
Yeah. Well, in the city, yeah. In Jerusalem, you walk a lot. Otherwise, you're on a bus. Well, I see it's almost quarter after. I do have, if you want, and if you know of somebody else that might be interested, I just have, this is a tentative itinerary of what we will be doing next January. There'll be some changes. But if you're interested, you can take one of those or pass it to somebody else. If you think there might be somebody else interested, I'm going to have probably sometime in February, I'll be having an information meeting once I get the costs and everything settled. And so if you want to know about that meeting, it'll be in the paper, I'm sure, but you can put a name and email or phone number down on here. So feel free to take that, and if you want to take a few moments to look and see what else is over here. Appreciate your attention.
How many people do you take on a trip?
Normally our groups are between 15 and 20.
Oh, that's what I was wondering.
Yeah.
In what, 2 weeks or?
It's usually a 10 to 11 day basic tour, and then there's an elective. We usually go to Petra. I don't know if you've heard of Petra. That's the Rose City or the Lost City in Jordan. And so we usually allow people, if they want to do an elective, they can go to Jordan for a couple days. Yeah, I've traveled there. The first group when I was with, there were 40 people on the bus.
Oh, that's a lot.
Those are, I don't, we usually get a big bus, but last time I had 15 people, so it was nice. Everybody gets on and off quick, get to do what you want, nobody gets lost in the old city. Get 40 people trying to go through there sometimes, that's a real headache. But. Again, thank you for coming.